Secret revealed by the nurse on her deathbed. One cold winter night, Mr. Bumble visited the poor house where Oliver was born. Mrs. Corney, who was in charge, entertained him to tea and biscuits. Mr. Bumble made these visits quite often and was getting rather fond of Mrs. Corney. She too enjoyed this attention from Mr. Bumble. Mr. Bumble finished his tea. He put an arm around Mrs. Corney and kissed her. Stop, Mr. Bumble, or I shall scream, she said. Just then there was a knock on the door and an ugly old woman peeped in. Corner, she said, old nurse Sally is dying. She has asked for you. She wants to tell you something very important before she dies. Please come fast. Mrs. Corner didn't like being disturbed while she was with Mr. Bumble, but she left him with apologies and followed the old woman. They reached the room where Sally lay dying. She was in great pain and her whole body, twisted with age, was shivering. She was half fainting and Mrs. Corney was getting impatient. She was about to go when the old woman in the bed sat up. Don't go, she said in a weak voice. Come here and listen to me. I have to tell you something before I die. Mrs. Corney was in two minds. However, curiosity overcame her impatience and she came back to the bedside. Old Sally had fallen back again on the bed and was breathing in short gasps. Mrs. Corney bent down and Sally began to whisper in her ear. In this very room, many years ago, I nursed a pretty young woman, she said. She was brought in here weak and fainting. She gave birth to a baby boy and then she died. Sally was panting for breath. What about the young woman? Asked Mrs. Corney. The boy was named Oliver, I remember, said Sally. Before she died, the young woman gave me a locket to keep safe for her. It was pure gold, but I stole it. I pawned it at a pawn shop. Mrs. Corney was interested now. I am ashamed, continued Sally. The gold locket might have saved the boy's life, but I was greedy. I hope the child is alive and someone has looked after him. Oh God! Sally's voice began to falter with weakness. He was called Oliver, she said, and fell back dead. Mrs. Corney took a small piece of paper that was in Sally's hand, called the attendants to cover the body and make arrangements for the burial. Mr. Bumble, meanwhile, was sitting near the fire in Mrs. Corney's room. He spent his time looking around, seeing the furniture, the crockery, and silver valuables. The room began to look nice and comfortable to him. At last, Mrs. Corney appeared. What a nuisance, she began. Old ladies dying at odd hours. Relax, Mrs. Corney, said Mr. Bumble, having some wine. He poured some wine and she drank it up. Now tell me, what has troubled you? Asked Mr. Bumble. Nothing, she replied. I was just upset by old Sally dying. Mr. Bumble moved his chair tenderly towards her. Nice, comfortable room you have here, he said. Another room like this, and it would be complete. One is quite enough for me, replied Mrs. Corney. Yes, but not for two people, said Mr. Bumble. The master of this workhouse is very sick and may live another week. I could take on the job. You and me will be very comfortable here. Will you marry me? Mrs. Corney did not hesitate. Yes, yes, I will, she said, embracing him. Mr. Bumble left to go to the Sowerberry's house to give order for a coffin for Sally. Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry were out. Noah Claypole was enjoying supper with Charlotte the maid as Mr. Bumble was peeping in. Noah was saying, Come here, Charlotte, and let me kiss you. Mr. Bumble burst into the room angrily. What is all this? He said. The maid screamed, and Noah was frightened and started stammering. What are young people coming to nowadays? Said Mr. Bumble while giving orders for the coffin. Kissing the maid indeed. Kissing. Ha ha.